Okay, good afternoon. This will be very different from what you heard this morning. Okay, so we're going to get into the ground motion side of things. So I've been involved in trying to move us from overly simplified ground motion models that are applied around the world, those are ergodic models, to non-ergodic models. And this has been 15 years, maybe a little bit more, that we've been on this journey, and we're finally getting there. Mainly what I've been doing in practice is trying to move research to implementation. How do you take advances in earth sciences and research papers and actually make them work in a seismic hazard calculation? And that's what I'm going to be talking about here. I will use Karen Sung, so Karen's her English name, has done all the work that I'm going to show. Okay, she is probably done more non-ergodic models than anyone else in the world. If you really want to talk to someone about how to do all this stuff, you should contact her. She's been doing a phenomenal job for me. Okay, so what are we trying to do? So we're trying to develop what we're calling these non-ergodic ground motion models. That means they're just site-specific, right? So in any other field, you wouldn't be taking average rock properties around the world and say they apply to my site, or average soil properties, or so forth. So how do we start to capture systematic differences in the site's path and source effects for a given location of where the earthquake is and where the site is? And the key of all this, so this has been done, people have been looking at this for a long time, but how do we get a model that will actually work for all locations? Not just where I happen to have the data. Because when I want to run seismic hazard, I need to have earthquakes in a new location or sites where I don't have any recordings. So what we're trying to do is to take the advances that have happened in the earth sciences and generalize them enough so that we have a model that will work for any condition, and I can plug it into a seismic hazard program. And we're going to do this by modifying reference ergodic models. So those are going to be our basic scaling that we have around the world. And we're going to modify things that are behaving linearly. Okay, this is going to allow us to take weak motion data and modify that part of the model. Anything that's more complicated, we're going to base that still on what's in the ergodic ground motion model. So any complicated magnitude scaling, or things like nonlinear site response, or effects of hanging wall and so forth, we don't try to get that from the non-ergodic terms. So there's three things we change when we go from ergodic to non-ergodic models. We change the median prediction. I'm 10 kilometers away from a magnitude 7, but for this particular location and that particular earthquake location, maybe the ground motion is 30% higher than average. Another, maybe it's 20% lower, right? So it could be positive or negative. You're not going to always get a smaller hazard when you run non-ergodic. It's going to be more accurate. That's what our goal is, not smaller. We'll get a reduction in the standard deviation. We're going to fit the data better because we have site-specific aspects, so our standard deviation is going to go down. But there's also additional epistemic uncertainty, because now I got to estimate my site-specific parameters, not just the global average. Okay, so that's what's going to happen going forward. In our ergodic ground motion models, we're going to think on the left-hand side is the ground motion that's observed. Then I have my median prediction, right? So that would be the equation that I'm using. I've averaged data from around the world. And then on the right-hand side, we break this up into two terms. So if you know ground motion, there'll be a between event term, delta B, that's an earthquake term, and then a within event term, the delta W. Think of these as unmodeled effects. So we've had years of trying to explain what do we mean by aleatory and epistemic uncertainty in seismic hazard. The median models are effects that we include in the model. And then anything we don't include in our model, because we've overly simplified it, is going to go into this residual on the end. And we think anything that we don't model, we're going to treat as random. It's not random, but that's how we're going to treat it. Okay? So we call this apparent aleatory variability. It's not really random. There's a physical process that controls how earthquakes work, But if I don't model it, my model has no ability to predict those behaviors, so we treat them as random. Okay, we're going to break this up instead of the simple case that's on the top to 6 different terms that are on the bottom. And we're trying to do this to make it more clear exactly what we're doing on the model. So those terms now, the first 2 are related to the site response. The terms that have like delta S2S, that's the median effect, the average effect. And then we have the variability of the site response, because it's not going to be the same depending on how the waves come in. Then there's an average path effect and a variability of the path effect, and there's an average source term and the variability of the source term. So this is source, path, and site. We have 6 pieces that in an ergodic model, we treat all of these as random. They're not, right? But that's how we're going to be treating them. So when we look at this, we're going to have these terms here, and they're going to have their standard deviation. The first 3 are things that could be estimated. But when I run an ergodic model, I choose not to estimate them. That's a choice of the person developing the model. Once you choose not to estimate something, it's treated as random in the context of the model, okay, even though it's not. Even this other stuff that's more complicated here, theoretically we could get at it, but it's not practical to get at these just yet. Okay, so these are treated as aleatory terms, and we have all these pieces. So I want you to think about the conscious decision that's made by the ground motion modeler to include or not include effects. Okay, and that determines what we treat as aleatory and what we treat as epistemic. This is back to work done 12, 13 years ago by Lin et al. On data from Taiwan on how these different pieces of the standard deviation go. So on the left-hand side here is our standard deviation in an ergodic model. We've lumped everything together. This was all in Taiwan together. And then you could see if we separated out how much are there systematic side effects, how much are there systematic path effects, how much are there systematic source effects, and then what's left over. Okay, what's left over are those other 3 terms there that are lumped together, okay? So we can go from numbers of 0.6 to 0.7 to numbers in the 0.35 to 0.45. That's a huge reduction in the standard deviation, meaning when we did an ergodic model, most of this is actually things that we could estimate, but we have chosen not to, okay? So why are we trying to move to non-ergodic models? So really we're thinking about these distributions. An ergodic distribution has a big broad range here, the black curve. I can take out just the site term. We call this a single station sigma model. It's a red, so a narrower distribution. And when I take out the path effects as well, I'm going to get an even narrower distribution. So this is really what's going to happen here. Again, these standard deviations change tremendously. So what I put here, about 60% of the variance is actually systematic effects that could be estimated. So when we treated it all as random, we were missing more than half of the problem. If we start to run hazard, and you want to think about this, I could have an ergodic model like this. So it's centered here. And then my non-ergodic model, I know the range is smaller, so I have a narrower distribution, but I haven't had that shift in the median. Remember I told you there's 3 things. We've shifted the median, we reduced the standard deviation, and then how well do we know that shift? Right? Those are the 3 things. If we look at hazard, which is just integrating these from right to left, this is what the hazard curves look like. This is a trivial example of a single source. So if you were near a fault that had a 1 in 200 year recurrence interval, you would get a black curve like this. This is an ergodic hazard, where the non-ergodic hazard, the way we think the Earth is actually behaving, would be one of these 5 curves. But if I have no data, I don't know which it is. This is a huge range. Okay, so I'm sitting here a factor of 5 in what my design ground motion would be. Okay. These are tremendous changes in what we're doing. When we ran ergodic, we assumed I know this number. Let's say I'm designing for 1 in 1,000. I would say I've got 0.43G, and you believe me. If instead I told you it's between 0.2G and 1G, that's our honest appraisal of what we can tell you. What are you going to design for then? Okay, if I give people that range, they say, I'm not doing my job because you're telling me this big range. What am I supposed to do? What do I need to choose out of this? So this is our huge problem here. How do we fix this? We need data. That's the only solution, right? So that I can start to figure out, am I on this orange curve, the green one, or am I at this range? Where am I going to be? As we start to have data, if we're looking at this, let's say I made these a little darker here. I had data and they were telling me it's between the green and the purple. All right? I get a shift to the left and I get steeper hazard curves because I have a narrower distribution. I can also say maybe I'm shifting it to the right. Okay, so maybe my answer is, I have data and it tells me it's between the orange and the light blue there. Right? So again, going from non-ergodic hazard is going to steepen up your curves, but they could shift either to the right or to the left. This change, as we start to move to hazard, is going to be the largest change we've had in seismic hazard since the introduction of the standard deviation in the 1980s. It's going to move your design numbers up and down by factors of 2. Code people don't like change. You heard some of that this morning, right? They don't want it to go up. They don't want it to go down. Just give me the same numbers. Do all the science you want as long as the answers come out the same. This is going to change things significantly as we go in this process. So we're going to use a reference ergodic model. We're then going to try to capture deviations from that, and we're going to look at 3 different terms. Simple things are the site, the path, and the source terms. And then how well do we know that? This is the epistemic uncertainty. How well do I have enough data to get at it? So when we go to single station sigma, we are taking out one of those parameters that was over here, and we're moving it to the median. So this delta S2S that used to be an unmodeled effect becomes a modeled effect. Okay? And that's now going to reduce my standard deviation because I only have 5 terms here instead of 6, okay, going forward. But now I have to estimate this term, so I have additional epistemic uncertainty. Right? If we look at how this works, so this black curve here, I'm going to treat our 3D simulations that we're going to treat as the correct answer. Right? This is how that Earth model is working. The dashed line here is an ergodic model. The ergodic model can be a lot higher than the black curve, or it can be, in this case, lower than the black curve. You don't know which way it's going to go. In general, the non-ergodic curves will end up being steeper. Okay? The blue curve is adjusting just for the site term that we were just talking about. So in some cases, adjusting for the site term gets you most of the way there. In other cases, it misses. Here it's coming down too low. Here it's coming too high. So we're going to try to do better than this by bringing the path terms into the problem. So as we start to do this, we can take more effects that are unmodeled, and I'm going to move them back here. So now all 3 of these we've reduced from unmodeled effects to modeled effects. And now our standard deviation is getting smaller, right? Because there's less unmodeled effects going forward. And so now we're also going to take this, and we're going to split this term, though, that we've called a path effect, into 2 physical behaviors. One due to Q, damping in the crust, and one due to the 3D velocity structure. Okay, those are 2 different behaviors. So I'm going to break this term down here into this. So now I've got 4 different non-ergodic terms I'm trying to bring along. Okay, for Q, the way this has been done is to try to say, if this is my fault, I would measure in a ground motion model the distance times some coefficients that's related to damping. And instead I can say, let me put a coefficient in each one of these cells and measure the distance within each cell and sum those up as a non-ergodic model, right? So that will be different whether I go one direction or another direction. And this has been used in several ground motion models. The problem is, this is an interesting scientific problem that has really very little relevance to seismic hazard that we care about. This is going to show up at large distances and short periods. I don't really care about 5 hertz ground motion at 200 kilometers away. It's interesting from the science, but we don't design for that. Here's an example, though, running this for France. So we've run some ground motion models. The ergodic model is shown by the gray line here. The non-ergodic model is shown here, and you can see greater than 100 kilometers, this is at 5 hertz, we start to see some deviations. This is a different path here, and in this case it's going up, right? So some places it'll be higher, and some places it'll be lower. The problem is back here at 20 to 30 kilometers, which controls the design, the same working on a nuclear power plant in France, they said, this is nice that you've done this, but it has no relevance to our design case, right? Because we're back here. So we've missed the important part. If we do look at standard deviations in France, these are in Fourier spectra instead of response spectra. This is the ergodic standard deviations. This is just taking out the site, and this is taking out the site and the Q terms, okay? So I'm getting a big reduction. The reason this has come down so much is most of their data was at large distances, okay? It's not really changing what's happening at short distances. This is an example using simulations from CyberShake. So for Los Angeles, here are ranges of path effects that they get. So the reds are, say, a factor of 2 higher, the blues are a factor of 2 lower. When we just model this with Q, we get no effect because we're at too short of a distance and at this long period of 3 seconds. So it's just not going to work. Okay, so modeling Q terms only, we've left this term, P to PV, in our unmodeled effects. It's much bigger than this one. We've missed the most important part of the problem, okay? So how do we get at this? This is a harder thing to get at because it's point to point. So every combination changes it. It's not just a simple adding up a sum of distances, okay? So it was easy to do this for the Q term. It's much harder to do it. Parker and Balté looked at this in a different way. They said, well, I'm going to take a site, let's say here. They're going to break the earthquakes into clusters, and they're going to calculate a term for each one of these clusters. And this is sort of the size of these adjustments. And they're big, okay? So these are, the difference between these is factors of 2, okay? So the problem with this is we can't use this model in a seismic hazard because it only works for earthquakes here. What happens when my earthquake is here, right? So we need something else. So we're going to make it applicable to all source and site pairs. And to do that, we use the variable coefficient model. It's just, I'm not going to go into the details of how that's done. Essentially, that's a way to smoothly extrapolate the model so that it fills in the space. And we look at the correlation distance and the variance of what the ground motions are. The difficulty is we have 2 paths or 2 vectors, right? So here's one vector and that vector. How do you measure the difference between 2 vectors? It's not as simple how far apart are my earthquakes or how far apart are my sites. We use one thing very simple, is we just said, well, let's take the sum of the distances between the 2 ends of the vectors. That was a trivial way to do it. We've also been looking at, let's look at how different are the origin points, how different are their azimuths, how different are their lengths. It's sort of getting more to vectors. We really found that both of these methods give us about the same fit to the data, so we need something else to really resolve the best way to do this. An example of this for Los Angeles is shown here. This is a site. This is now a smooth model where I have filled in where I didn't have data, but it's a model that will work now for any source location. So this works in a hazard calculation. The uncertainty, though, this is these darker green lines are where I actually had sources. I know that better, so those are smaller epistemic uncertainties. When I get into an area where I didn't have sources, but I put it in there, that's where my future earthquake is, I get a bigger epistemic uncertainty. Okay, if you look at how this might look in attenuation, this is a couple of sites doing the same thing. The ergodic model is the dashed line here, or railroad track line, then the dashed line is just the site. And then going on different directions, you can see my attenuation goes up and down. And now this shows up at shorter distances. This shows up at distances that we care about for seismic hazard. Right? So this is really the key to making this whole thing work. If we look at what's happening from the 3D, these are 3D simulations. In our ergodic models, we have all of these different components that are treated as aleatory. Not that they are aleatory, but that's how they're treated. And I get a sigma of 0.63. If I bring in just the site and model that, my sigma goes down to 0.59. If I add Q, it goes down to 0.587. There's no effect, essentially, of Q. If I bring in the path term, the velocity structure term, it's down to 0.48. That's where we're getting the big bang, all right, for our buck here. So this is the key to making these models work. An example now here is that same cases where the ergodic model is the dashed line here, the thin one. The black curve is what we're treating as true, and the pink curve is our smooth model that we've used from our non-ergodic approach. And so now you can see, while we move from this line here to the blue for the site, we actually get a much better fit using now our path term as we brought that in. So we have a functioning ground motion model that will work for any site location and any source location. As you get further away from where you have actual data to constrain it, our epistemic uncertainty just gets bigger. And you can see here, in this case, it's almost the same as what the site was. That is, the path effects were effectively canceling out. Usually that means more than one source is controlling the hazard, and one source was a positive and the other source was a negative, and so they kind of give you the same answer. And here's a case where it's going the other direction. The site was underestimating it. We got most of this. We didn't pick up all of this. The pink line and the black line are a little different, telling you this is the simplifications that we've made in smoothing the model. Okay? The thin pink lines are our epistemic uncertainty. How well do we think we know it? So this starts to give me a range of what the answer is. So when we're trying to deal with simulations, we have several different sets. We have multiple scenarios, or simulations, multiple realizations from one scenario. 3D simulations are expensive, right? And they're hard to set up, so sometimes people just run one scenario. Ideally, you're going to run multiple scenarios. If I want to get path effects out, I got to be able to have multiple directions. I can't just have one direction happening. The other key limitation we have is these are run for one 3D velocity structure. In seismic hazard, we have to have the epistemic uncertainty. So I need you to run multiple velocity structures. That hasn't happened, so I'm making up a number here. I know it's not 0, so I'm going to stick a number in there and tell me what is a better value to use. Okay? So the issue that we start to get here is when we have one source, we can't distinguish between path and site, and so we get a combined path and site term. Okay, so we can't figure out how to do that. We're trying to use site terms from empirical data that have multiple paths to try to constrain that, but this is a problem we're still working on. When we look at all this from empirical data, these are examples in Fourier spectra for different regions, Taiwan, France, and California, of ergodic models. Then we have models with the site and the Q, and then the lowest models are when we bring in this path effect, right? So that really starts to change the numbers. What we're doing now is moving to intensity data. You say, why are you doing this? Intensity data is terrible, right? How do we know what, intensity is a measure of damage. It's not a direct measure of the ground motion, but our 3D simulations only help us at the longer periods, okay? Our intensity data helps us because we actually have data from historical events, big ones that we can use. We have dense spatial sampling from the new Did You Feel It data, so every kilometer we have numbers. Our data set, we're working now over 500,000 observations from 4,000 earthquakes. This is a huge data set to use, but there's difficulties with it. Here are, in California, this is important for us, we have the Fort Tejon earthquake, we've got the San Francisco 1906 earthquake, in the Bay Area we've got the Hayward event. All of this stuff now we can use to check the models, as opposed to just using small earthquakes. One way people use intensity is try to convert it to the ground motion model. That's not the way to do the problem. So don't do this, okay, is my suggestion. There's a really large bias in the conversion. Instead, we want to use residuals of the intensity, which means we need a good intensity prediction equation to start with. These don't exist right now. We have to go back and derive some new ones, but I'll show you how it goes. We then check how well do path terms from the intensity data correlate to path terms from the ground motion data. So intensity data looks something like this. If I just put PGA and intensity here, you'll see what looks like a strong correlation. This is not causal. This is a correlation that they both depend on magnitude and distance, not that they're related to the ground motion. So this gets us into all sorts of problems if you follow this kind of scaling. Okay, so instead we're going to avoid a direct conversion. We're going to, again, get the path terms from the intensity data, and then we're going to look at the correlations. So here's an example of data from ground motion data, path terms, and intensity, epistemic uncertainty, and then the intensity data. You can see how much denser our sampling is of the intensity, right? We have a lot more measurements here to work with. If we start to look at how are these correlated, so this is the path term from intensity on the x-axis and the path term from PGA on the y-axis. In some of these azimuths, they're pretty well correlated. In other azimuths, they're not so well correlated. And this is what we're trying to work through. What's happening there? Is it really the underlying ground motion intensity prediction equation that needs improvement? But we do have something here, right? So there's information there. We can look at another case here. This is another event going to intensity data. We see some good correlations and some poor correlations. And this is going to a larger magnitude, a magnitude 7. Again, I could have a lot more intensity stations compared to my ground motion station. So this is why we're trying to go to intensity, because of the density of the stations, and we need to work through this issue of how do we improve the correlation between the path terms. This is going for a whole bunch. This is large magnitude PGA, and then we also looked at longer periods. It doesn't work a lot better for the longer periods, so I think the intensity data is mainly going to tell us about the short periods. So in all of this, we need to constrain the path effects at short distances. We can't get at this unless we get a lot more data, a whole bunch more ground motion data. It's still hard to get it at short distances. Simulations help us at the short distances, but they're only working at the long periods. And the intensity can help us at the short distances, but we've got all the problems of intensity data, but it will help us on the short period part. Okay, so to move forward, what do we need? For ground motions, we need to have multiple paths sampled, okay, different directions. So we're using smaller magnitudes to get more and more events. That's why we started to make the ground motion models work for small magnitudes. Not because we cared about that for engineering or design, but we want to be able to measure the difference between the attenuate or path effects in one area versus a path effect in another area. Okay, we also have a problem of calibrating the magnitudes at these small earthquakes. Okay. If we go to 3D simulations, we need, for me, multiple source locations are more valuable than multiple realizations at the same location. I would rather have, so previous examples have run 20 to nearly 100 realizations for one source. I would rather have them done 10 sources and a fewer realizations on each one. Then we can start to separate path and side effects. Then this whole problem of we need the uncertainty due to the velocity structure. And that's just not available right now. And I think it's probably a really big term that we need to pay attention to. And the intensity data, we're going to have to go back and redo the intensity prediction equations. If you look at them, they look like ground motion models in the 1980s. Okay, we need to bring them up to the same statistical treatment that's used in ground motion models. And so, in conclusion, this transition to non-ergodic ground motion models is going to significantly improve accuracy of seismic hazard. We're not reducing your hazard. It will turn out about 70% of the sites will see a reduction and about 30% of the sites will see an increase because of the skewed nature of the hazard calculations. They're approximately log-normally distributed. The biggest effects are going to be the site and the velocity term, the path term due to the velocity structure. The VS30 is a good proxy for site response, like in California, Taiwan, and New Zealand, then the path effect is going to be the biggest part. In other areas where VS30 doesn't work so well, Japan, Chile are good examples of that, then this should say the site term, delta S2S, will have the largest effect. And then given this spatial sampling, the sparse spatial sampling of seismic networks, we got to get 3D simulations, and we need to bring in the intensity data to play on this problem to help us start to constrain the problem. All right, and I think I finished on time. Thank you.